Welcome, thinkers, to Season 4, Episode 24 of Thinking Critically. No big updates this week. We've managed to get the episode out on time, which is the biggest thing ever I could have ever hoped for. Otherwise, I just shill the normal things, which is head to thinkingcritically.co.uk to take a look at everything and over 100 hours of back catalogue of the show, and also Dungeons, Dice and Dudes, DD&D Pod, the actual play podcast I am a player in. Otherwise, yeah, that's it. Nothing. Just strap in for a banger of an episode. You had a nice short one a couple of episodes ago, less than an hour. This is now, you're paying back. That time, an hour and a half. So strap in. Great episode. Fantastic guests. Plural, that's right. So yeah, I hope you enjoy. And let's get on with the show. And it is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the cast and hosts of Tabletop Journeys. Thank you ever so much for returning to the show again, guys. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the show and yourselves?
Daniel, it is awesome to be back here. It feels so long since we have been on the show. We're really chuffed to be back. So thanks for having us. I'm Josh, one of the hosts. Tabletop Journeys is a show all about role-playing in all of its various facets. We do content shows, rules deep dives, book deep dives, actual plays, etc., etc.
And I'm Glen, one of the other hosts, Glen Myers. Love being part of Tabletop Journeys. Love being back on Thinking Critically. Always a good time. And we got one more guy here because there's three of us.
Yes, thank you for that introduction. I am Lewanika, and also amazingly happy to be back on Thinking Critically, one of the earliest podcasts I started listening to, one of my favorite podcasts to guest on. Have a blast. And Tabletop Journeys, in addition to all the things that Josh mentioned, we are also content creators. We write stuff, and we'll talk about all of that throughout the show and later, but we love writing, and we freelance a little bit, so hashtag call your boys TTJ.
Yes, amazing. So previous episodes that we've talked about in the past on motivation season recently.
2, 3?
Yeah.
Two
A while ago.
Yeah.
Season a while ago.
A while ago. Because my screen says season 4, and that didn't sound right because we're in season 4 now. And I was like, that's not correct. And then Space, all the way back in season 1, 2021. Jeez Louise. I
think that was the first show that we actually appeared on as a group. And Glenn, if I
No
remember
way.
right, you either weren't on staff yet for the show, or you
I
couldn't
was,
make it
but
to
I
make
had
that day?
just come on, and you
Yeah.
had gotten you got the invite like the next day, and you know, we hadn't even done any recording with me yet.
Right.
So it was just you and Lewanika in that one.
Yeah, that was a while
Yes.
back.
But we did fix that because we had Danilo on our show a couple weeks or months later, where we continued that conversation because that was such a great topic space that we had to have. We had to carry it on forward, so we kind of borrowed/stole from Danilo's amazing format, and then we did TTJ Tabletop Journeys version of that, where we finished the conversation, had an additional couple topics of discussion.
That's the one that I always point people to when people are like, what's the show about? I go, we take a single word or topic, which might sound two-dimensional, but in fact is the opposite, because I always refer to the space episode to be like, oh, okay, they're going to talk about something completely not what I had in mind. I had not prepared for what this discussion that's now happening.
We went way afield of whatever it looked like it was going to be on face value, and it was where the conversation took us. And that's actually an episode I re-listen to from time to time, just to kind of, we talked a lot about techniques and tips that are really good for building up your games and making your games exciting and engaging. And so I will re-listen to that just so I can prepare myself for different adventures that I run currently, because there were so many good nuggets in that one. That was like, for you and for us, probably our best set of episodes, among our best set of episodes. Really, really good stuff.
Well, thank you, and it's all. I can't take any credit. It's all from the guests, of course. And
Oh, come on. Host get some credit. Don't be too modest.
I have to set a meeting up. Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
It's not just about setting the meeting up. You're part of the conversation. Conversations include everybody.
I'm British. I'm modest.
Right. No. I feel that you're trying to downplay your role in this, and I'm not allowing it.
And I will just say, you actually picked the topic on that one and sent that up. And so everywhere we went was based on what you gave us. The perfect improv. You put it out there. You set that scene, and we yes-anded through, 2 hours of content.
It was a long time. Yeah, it was a lot. Yeah.
And there was a lot of good stuff there, and that's just what made it on air. There was other pieces that kind of got clipped and stuff that honestly were very useful, as well as a first step in a wonderful friendship. So I mean, awesome.
And I very much one final piece of the host's prerogative, but I very much consider Tabletop Journeys my sister podcast from from the other side of the world almost.
Oh, that means a lot. I mean, truly.
How have you guys been? How's your show going? How are we doing? Everyone good? Happy?
Yeah, I mean, everything's great. So I personally, my wife and I just had a daughter a few months ago. She's almost
so
5 months old. She's absolutely adorable, and probably like the most well-behaved baby of all time, which is very, very lucky because my wife and I run around like crazy people. So that's very, very good. So personally, things are going awesome, and I haven't even told these fine gentlemen yet. So I'll reveal this for the first time too. We are just about to go ahead and hit our 50,000th download.
Wow,
which is insanity. Like if you had said, thank you. Yeah, if you said like 3 years ago,
I'm gonna clap on that too.
Right? You know, it was a little over a year ago that we hit 25,000 downloads, and so it's been an insane year, absolutely crazy. So, a multitude of blessings. I mean, including the fact that we just actually put out the final copy of our third book too. The Kickstarter book that we did back in September finally went to press and finally went out to the Kickstarter backers. So it's nice to have that project done. So
right, and we promise our next one will be faster. We learned a lot,
or at least more properly timed.
Yeah,
well, that's more accurate, more properly timed.
Yeah. In addition to all of that, we have, like so many of us, content creators, whether it be just podcasts and YouTube, or just writers of amazing tabletop games, we have all been through a huge, nearly PTSD creating struggle with Wizards of the Coast and the OGL. And I'm not going to belabor this too much, other than to say, like everybody else, we had to take time to evaluate what we do, how we do it, and what we're going to do.
Right.
As things worked out in that venue, we figured out all of those things, and we are on the better side of it. And we have great ideas for the future. We've shifted some of our focuses. We've started doing some alternate game content. Specifically, we've started with the Star Trek Adventures RPG by Modiphius Entertainment. Happy to say they are a company that comes from England, of all places, the UK, and a pleasure to have conversations with their freelance writers, their line editors, and just their community has been amazing for that game. And
the game's super fun too.
The game is amazing. All of those other things, that icing on the cake and the cherry on top, is wonderful, and it's really been an energizing factor in what we do on the show. It's not going to stop with just doing Star Trek Adventures. We have plans for other games as we go throughout this year. The goal is to be focused on tabletop games. We're not forgetting 5e, but our goal is to kind of cover all the things that make tabletop gaming fun, energizing, borrow from games, even if it's a system you're not playing in, to add to the game in the system that you are playing in. So that's kind of where we're headed.
My secret ulterior motive of the show was to find out more games and play more games and stuff. So this is all great. And it was a success with you guys in the past. So I'm just going to steal your thoughts as normal for the third time. So
I mean, we share thoughts back and forth, Daniel. Let's be honest.
Our Star Trek Adventures, Lewanika was a little bit modest about it because he's the mastermind behind it. But our Star Trek Adventures Patreon game is going to be something truly special. It's kind of taking all players from our Patreon that want to play and blending them into one crew. It just means that not every crew member is in every episode. And so it's almost like an unlimited number of people can play. Lewanika and Josh are both co-storytelling, two different groups that could rotate players. It's going to be so much fun.
Yeah.
And it's going to be so exciting. Right now, our session 0, part 3 just came out. So our first actual episode should be coming up this next week, I believe. And
Tuesday,
I'm really excited.
Yeah,
Oh,
it should
that's
air
perfect timing.
right before this episode airs if scheduling holds fast. Yeah.
Yes. Awesome. Well, I'm gonna labor a segue now. As I was hoping at some point in this introduction there'd be somewhere I can dive in and be like, good, that would be the one. And this is what I'm gonna use. Is you're talking about so many players, you've got two different groups, in two different DMs. Another word for groups is maybe factions.
Yep.
Which happens to be
right. There's a ship
the
and
topic.
and a space station, so you got a space station faction and a ship faction.
Yes, precisely. Thank you. See, it wasn't that tenuous a link. I'm happy with that. That's what
Colloquially called crews.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
So today's topic is faction or factions. So opening the floor, as everybody knows, what does that mean to you in the D&D and, of course, wider TTRPG framework?
We've been talking about factions for going on 2 years now. It's an idea that's been bubbling on our back burner with a file in our Google Drive that slowly gets more and more things added to it. That's going to culminate into something that we'll talk about at some point during this episode. But coming up with new, exciting, believable, not realistic, because we play a fantasy game, so I'm not going to say realistic, but lifelike and vibrant factions that help add depth to your world. That's a topic that's near and dear to our hearts.
Yep.
Okay, so we're talking then macro scale factions, right? So we're talking like the Kingsguard, capital K, capital G.
Right.
That kind of big group of individuals who are operating and having an impact on the world, right? That's the level we're talking about.
Yeah, that's a really great example to go ahead and bring up, because I'll be honest, as I've been kind of filling out this Google Doc and kind of thinking about factions in kind of a structural sense, one of the things that has been a challenge for me has been designing factions which are not solely full of bad guys or solely full of kind of opposition forces. Now, I don't want to say necessarily bad guys, right? Because but opposition forces. Because I think
there should be forces for good too.
Yeah, because when I think of factions, my first thought is not necessarily to a fantasy setting, but is more to like cyberpunk, like Shadowrun, right? You think about kind of the corporate structure that runs everything. You, as the players, are part of kind of the seedy underbelly that's moving against that big corporate machine. You are part of the faction that is kind of trying to oppose the political machine that is ruling everything. And so it's been an interesting kind of thought experiment to try to think outside of that kind of very narrowly defined box that the word has held in my brain. So,
So I too was thinking about that, and I thought of examples of factions or examples that could be factions in a tabletop setting, and I turned to media, specifically movies and epic television that you'll see on various channels. If you wanted to start with Star Trek, because that's where our segue began with, you could look at the Federation, the Klingons, the Romulans. Each of those are factions, right?
the Dominion.
But the Dominion, to look at DS9 and Picard Season 3. But you can also go within any of those organizations and find factions within. Within the Federation, you have Starfleet. That's a faction within the greater Federation. You also have within that faction, you have Section 31, which is separate from Starfleet Intelligence, which is separate from Starfleet Corps of Engineers, which is separate from the Starfleet Medical Division, which is separate
the
from
Daystrom Institute. Yeah.
the Daystrom Institute. So you have all of these factions within factions, which are interesting things to play with when you're building your world. Looking at a more high fantasy or not necessarily high fantasy, but a fantasy setting, you can look to Game of Thrones. Each of those houses was a faction. And if you look at the history of Game of Thrones on television, season by season, you were introduced to one or two houses at a time. Basically, every couple of episodes, you got a new house. We were almost 3/4 of the way through season 2 or 3 before even though we had heard the name, before we were introduced to House Martell. But then by that time, we were also getting other factions. late in season 1, we were introduced to the Swords Masters of Bravos. We were introduced to, at some point, to the Faceless Men. We were introduced to the Black Watch. We were introduced to the Freemen north of the Wall. Each of those were factions within this greater world. So in my head, factions is a way to build your world, or a way to describe elements of your world and show it. It's easy to say this is the kind of world I have, but how do you show that? Showing those factions is a great shorthand that makes good narrative sense for players, because they can interact with a person or a couple of people, or have a run-in, an encounter positively or negatively. They can get help by, they can see this faction working against this other faction, even if they're just passing them on the road. They can learn a lot about the world they're in with factions, and that's the kind of thing that I think of when I think.
And without going to the complete macro scale of world-sized factions that can get into governments, government organizations, etc., a lot of times when I work on factions, I actually do work on more of a micro scale, or a kingdom scale, or down even to a city scale sometimes. Sticking with Lewanika's pop culture, current television analogy, Shadow and Bone is an example in Ketterdam. The Gangs of the Barrel are all small factions, Pekka Rollins, Dime Lions. And, well, in the show, it's Kaz Brecker steals the dregs and turns them into crows, but in the books, he starts out as a lieutenant in the dregs and then stages a coup and becomes the crows, but that's neither here nor there. But each one of those small gangs that run the barrel, the seedy underbelly of Ketterdam, is a faction of itself, and they all have interactions between each other that make that environment, the barrel in particular, but all of Ketterdam, such a dangerously vibrant and seedy place. Without them, it would just be, a bad neighborhood with some muggers and thugs. But with them, you've got multiple organized crime elements working towards the same goals sometimes, but often against each other, creating all kinds of plot and intrigue in that environment. So if you get a couple of good, well-established factions that have roots in wherever you're placing them, whether it's macro or micro, whether you're growing a big faction that's going to span continents, or a small one that's going to pretty much just take up the local town and county, whatever area you've attached them to, they're going to breathe life into it. They're going to add new directions, they're going to add new players, they're going to add new political pressures and social pressures that change the stories that you're telling within those areas, and they're fantastic.
Yeah, because I think that's really where the magic of a distinct faction of non-player or even player characters comes from. That's really where the magic is that as a group, they have their own motivations, right? And to go ahead and throw back to another show that we had about motivation, right? That particular group operates within its own space for its own reasons, and sometimes it's in line with, if we use like a faction of non-player characters, just as an example, sometimes those motivations may be in line with the players, sometimes they may not be in line with the motivation of the players, sometimes they are adversarial, sometimes they're in parallel. So there's a lot of ways that you can align their trajectories and make them interact with the players. I think that's really where the magic of a faction comes in, is in that, without being group thoughty about it, but realizing that faction as its own machine travels its own direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's loads there to unpack. And the one thing I wanted to start with is that is a classic tip to GMs, is that it's better to show, don't tell. And not just GMs, but also writers and that kind of creative endeavor in general, is that show, don't tell. And I think factions, as three of you have put it well, is a very, very, very good vehicle for doing precisely that. From the Thieves Guild, there's a mugger on the street. Oh, but they're part of a Thieves Guild. And suddenly it isn't just some random villain on the street that you can all hit on the head with your swords for half an hour. It's part of a bigger thing. And why does this city have a Thieves Guild and the other one doesn't, and so on and so on? And are they honorable or are they not honorable? And blah blah blah, and all just spins out of there all the way up to the vast world consuming factions of evil domains and geopolitical movements and everything. Is such a fantastic way to world build without laboring it too much, without being too on the nose or too an hour of exposition of the GM talking, which I don't think anybody finds too fun.
No.
Well, I think GMs actually can fall into the trap of finding a lot of fun in going into that hour of exposition. I myself, I'm going to call myself out. I have done that in many a games that my two co-hosts have probably played in, where it's like, oh, or edited. I could go on and on and on, and it's like, that's wonderful. None of that matters until you have that one character that shows up. DS9 is the perfect example of this. Section 31, when they decided to develop that for DS9, they didn't talk about Section 31. They had one character. We didn't see multiple characters from Section 31. We didn't see a second Section 31 character until I think their second appearance. And they only appeared like 4 or 5 times, yet they are one of the most exciting and electric factions in Star Trek for me personally. They have a whole book in Last Unicorn Games from 6 episodes. I think that says a lot about how you show a faction, how you bring that to the table. In some cases, it's one person, and then through role play, conversation, conflict, discussion, whatever you're doing, then you learn about what they tell you they're from. And then it's up to the players to decide, do you want to know more? And let the players drive that piece. And then as they want to know more, you should have it. What we are talking about here is if you have an idea of your faction and the bones of it ready to go, when the players latch onto that faction, now you're ready to answer that question. And it sounds like you've had it planned the entire time.
Yeah. I remember the example that I was going to use is when I kind of first realized the power of distinct factions, and it was in the D&D at that time D&D 3rd edition game that Lewanika and I played in for years and years and years, because up until that point in my storytelling and everything, I had sort of conflated the idea of factions and species, right? That like all dwarves think the same because dwarves live under the mountains and they're miners, and so all dwarves have this, and all elves think the same because they, all that sort of tie-in. And that was really kind of the first time that I saw not just distinct factions, but distinct factions that crossed species lines, right? So it's like when this group of humans who live in the mountains and the dwarves function together, here's what happens. And so like breaking down the line between a faction and tying it directly to its species was like mind changing. It opened up so many different possibilities to go ahead and see kind of, and I think that we're seeing it a lot in the way that like the way that Kobold is right now kind of like tromping out its competitor to 5e, but breaking down backgrounds into something that we've been talking about for, and specifically Lewanika has been talking about forever, but talking about the difference between nature versus nurture, right? What were you born to be versus how are you raised, and what is that? Kind of taking those two distinct pieces and breaking them out of your background.
And then what choices you made outside of that. So it's the 3
Yeah.
pieces that make the whole.
Yeah. So, I mean, when you start thinking about it on those kind of levels, like the number of possibilities that emerge is infinite.
Endless.
So, yeah.
I would also say an early faction discussion for me was Vampire the Masquerade. So, which is a game that's all about factions when you break it down. Every vampire clan, every werewolf tribe, even the moons of the various werewolves, even the generations of the various vampire clans, the various sects, the types of magic for the Tremere, anti-tribute versus the standard vampire,
the Camarilla versions,
Camarilla versions, because they're not cool enough like the Sabbat to have a title. Yes, I'm joking, but I am all I am all Asambra all the time. Everybody should know that. But I think of that game as being very faction based, and when I ran my very first LARP, I played in several, and I started a LARP called Shadows of Power.
Shadows of Power, yeah.
A fun game that was exclusively faction based, and I basically took a Ventru character who was the prince of the city of Boston, and I basically built businesses. I took and homebrewed basically character sheets for businesses that gave the businesses influences, and they were run by various vampires and things like that. So people who worked for a given business could borrow that, and they could buy, and the businesses that these vampires would run, they're actually like a group run character. And I loved that element of it. And some of my players interacted with that and others did not. The ones that interacted with that did amazing things as they interacted. And it was a lot of fun. It was, elements of that I still bring into current stories outside of Vampire the Masquerade. Even when I play a modern 5e based game, some of the businesses that were brought out in that Vampire, I still bring those out, and I bring out the characters and some of their actions. I leave out the vampire elements, but I still love how that worked, and it still resonates. When you're doing factions, allowing your players to interact with them, join them, change them, stop them in some cases, is again the greatest way to build interaction.
I love that you brought up Vampire the Masquerade right after Josh brought up the dwarves and the elves, because the way that the two of you put it, and it's kind of going back a little bit in the conversation, sorry, but it really, really illustrated the point of depth that we were trying to make earlier, because without factions in Vampire the Masquerade, vampires would just be blood-sucking fiends from the dark. That's it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? They would just be monsters. There would be no society. There would be no intrigue. There would be no story. If all of the dwarves were like Josh used to see them, as just dwarves, they all think the same because they're dwarves. They like stone. They like hammers. Then dwarves would be super boring.
Right.
If you didn't have the Hearthguard, if you didn't have the Miners Guild and the Crafters Guild and all of those different factions of dwarven society intermingling to create a society, it would just be flat, two-dimensional cardboard people with beards.
Right.
So here's a question that I wanted to say. Obviously, we would, I hope, typically encourage players to entwine their characters with things that are existing in the world, or help you build new things to exist in the world via factions. Typically is one primary way to do that. For those regular listeners of the show, especially of last episode, I mentioned how one of the guys in my game that I play in, he has made a huge, very complicated backstory that I think he's ripped from like 3 different places and smushed them all together, and it's
Right.
very hard to follow, so much so that we've had to say, dude, break this down for us. And he's like, oh yeah, no, he did send me, I said, can you just give us a cheat sheet? And he said, yeah, I'll just drop you a couple of sentences. And it was like a whole, on WhatsApp, it was like the whole screen of text. And I was like, okay, fine. When we sat down to play the other day, he was like, oh, should I send, I gave Danlo like a cheat sheet. Should I send that to everybody? And I was like, yeah, everybody needs this help. And he's like, oh, okay, I'll get it up. Oh, there's quite a lot there, isn't there? I didn't realize it was that much. And I was typing it. I was like, yeah, dude, there's a lot to he's like, he was a farmer, then he was in the royal family, then he was in the knights, the temple knights, but then he ran away, and this, that, and the other. And what I'm building to is that what considerations have to be made then from a world building perspective when you start to bring in the players and obviously their agency, their freedom that they have, which is inherently chaotic to an extent. And also from the player's perspective, because not to talk about, say, alignment too much, because nobody likes talking about that two-dimensional thing a huge amount, but obviously there used to be historically a framework that characters would operate in, and factions kind of are another way to provide that framework. Say you're a harper, you operate, benevolently and selflessly, to within reason, and that again, constraints is too hard of a word, but frameworks provides a set of parameters to work within. So as a two-pronged question there, because you've humoured me and allowed me to ramble on so much so that I stumbled into another set of questioning. But we'll start with the first one then, from a world building perspective. How do we handle building with our players factions that they are a part of, or in some way a stakeholder of, without kind of the world either falling down or the player losing agency?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely have thoughts. I think all of us have kind of like picked up style in this regard, but I came to the podcast as a very collaborative storyteller, right?
Mm-hmm.
I very much provides some kind of big framework in the games that I want to play, and really I really trust my players to fill in those gaps for me. So to use your example of your player, maybe he'll listen to this episode and he can go ahead and take this on. But like a character who grew up on a farm and joined this group and then left that group to go to another group and everything like that.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I guess the easy answer is to go ahead and say, unless those groups already existed in my game, I would rely on them. I would steer them through questions to go ahead and flesh out, like, okay, so that group of knights that you belonged to, what was their ambition? What was their goal? Why were they assembled? Who was their patron? Why did you leave? What was the group's opinion of you leaving? You know, some real kind of some leading questions, and let them kind of define those. And then you kind of take that information back and you say, okay, so I know the Big Master framework. The player has given me all these little hooks. What does this actually mean within the, because there's another faction of knights that relate to it. How do these two knight groups get along? You know, that kind of thing. Like, so I think really from a world building point of view, that's how I kind of approach that problem, is that if a player comes to me and says, I'm a member of this group, it's also on them to go ahead and flesh that group out for me, at least to go ahead and give me the hooks. And ask them, the 20 questions of role playing, like as if they're creating another character, kind of like Lewanika said, how he had those character sheets for businesses, right? Kind of the same thing, where it's like, okay, so tell me about this group of knights. Why did you leave? What was it? How was leaving perceived? Is it more like the Night's Watch from Game of Thrones, or is it more like the Gold Cloaks? Because even though they have a lot of commonality, they also had really big differences, right? So I think that's, from a world building point of view, that's kind of where my thought on it sits.
And I love your style of collaborative world building, Josh. Some of my favorite faction work that I've done, I did by lifting a page out of your book when we were working on the one D&D AP that's never going to air these days.
So much fun, yeah.
But for each of you, as you're creating your characters and you came up with pieces of your background, by the time it was done, I had 6 players, each building a different piece of the society for me because of what they tied themselves to. So then I did exactly what you're talking about. I learned it from you. Lewanika was talking about his family and how they were related to the elf peacekeeping force. So I'm like, okay, what does that look like? Who runs it? And it was fantastic. And the world was coming together and to an amazingly vibrant little shard. Maybe it'll get relived in some other system at some point.
Some other system. I beg of you, please do. The amount of fun we had with those 2 sessions that we played should never be forgotten. Even if they don't air, those of us who played in those sessions, I can honestly tell you, and I've played in a lot of games for you, those were 2 of the most exciting and finest sessions you've run for me in 37 years of gaming. Period. Full stop. Do that again.
Even with my kerfuffle on the portals and forcing your choice because I didn't plan to.
Hey, look.
Thank you. That's high praise.
That kerfuffle was not nearly as bad as some of the ones I've had. I think it was Matt Damon speaking about Ben Affleck who said, don't judge me about my bad ideas. I want you to judge me about the good ideas.
Yeah. Of course.
That's how I view it. I mean, it was an amazing episode. I think that my style drew from a couple of different sources. It is clarified and improved based on the work that Josh has done with us with Tabletop Journeys over the last couple of years and solidifying the framework and format to collaborative world building, our first book. But it is something that I kind of been picked up from a couple different storytellers. Benito, friend of our show, who runs the live play on YouTube, actual play on YouTube, Streams of Sphero and Old Ways of Sphero, both of which I'm a player in. Glen is a player in Streams of Sphero. And I will also add that is the person who ran the game that Josh was referring to, the 3.5, 3.0 and 3.5. And he was actually doing this back in 2nd edition as well, where basically as your character developed, he would have you interact with NPCs. And then as a campaign winded down, where he would then, if you survived, because not everybody survived every campaign, if you survived, where you settled, by the time we started the next campaign, which would generally be 30 or 40 years later, that society changed to be like you. So your character became the foundation for a faction. And then he worked with you in between campaigns to develop concepts. You would basically say, he would say, what are your goals for your area? If you were to build X, what would it look like? And then he would tell you. Sometimes he'd make you roll. Sometimes he'd just do things depending what other players did in their separate areas. And we literally built this continent with separate kingdoms where many of the communities were reflections of the way we played our previous characters. So between that work, that was simultaneous to what I was doing in Vampire the Masquerade and the LARPs, simultaneous to where Josh was building his style as well. Separately, as Glenn and I got back together and he started, and we would run individual games, we would have little elements of that. I think of the Thieves Guild that we played. It was like a Thieves Guild, even though we didn't think of ourselves like that. Fists of Toril, which we played with our friend Dustin Hendel. We have always been doing these things, and which leads me to my general thought, which is I think GMs are instinctively building factions. They may not know it, but they are instinctively building factions. Players, as they interact with our games, specifically homebrew games, are building factions or interacting with factions without possibly knowing it. When you're purposeful about it, that's when you get a higher level of engagement. Collaborative world building is a technique. I take session zeros to say, okay, even before we got rules like Tales of the Valiant that broke down those 3 elements we spoke about earlier, I was asking those questions anyway. I would take those bonds, flaws, ideals questions to try to get to that and build that up. In my current games that I've been running for the last 4 to 5 years, I have players who like to interact with the world, so I build factions around them. So I have a player who brought in a thief character and had a history. So we connected that to an old character I used to play and a faction that I had a dream of. And then as that character interacted and wanted to do different things, I built that faction around some of those ideas, both as help and opposition to that character's goals. So her growing within the faction to rival her father for direction of that faction became important. She recruited other players into that faction. They each are kind of doing their own thing. And now here we are, 20th level. And I started this group back at 6th level with this specific group. 20th level, I gave them a year plus in downtime, and I did a bunch of roles, did it right in session with these players about what they want to do. I have a cleric who's bringing back religion to the area, and we did roles for every town they went to, and how many people were favorable and the percentage of people that were favorable. And I got a little granular with it, but they were all in. I literally, built up cadres of NPCs, which can later be marshaled for the grand war that's going to end this whole campaign. And it was literally a situation, not to get overly religious about it, but this single priest of this faith walked around town by town in the north proselytizing and angered some people in some towns, so sometimes they're actively against them, worshipped and loved in other towns, and there are some that are neutral but mostly favorable. And then we had this whole section where it's like, I want to go to my hometown, which happens to be the headquarters for the bad guys. He actually has a price on his head there, and we did the whole role play, like he did stealth rolls to go in and proselytize and talk to people and try to build within that faction. And at the end, he was safe and got out, but he was noticed. So some of the people he spoke to at the end of that whole scene, they were martyred. And now it's like he's on the outside, his hometown, his mentor, the character that started him on his path all those sessions ago, a character he actually created in the building of that character, has now been martyred because he now follows the faith in the way that the character did. He brought that mentor around. He was now mentoring the mentor. And now that mentor is gone. And now that has galvanized him for the next step. I can't tell you what that is because that was literally our last session. Our next session is in a couple of weeks. But that's the kind of engagement that you can get if you are a bit more purposeful about factions.
I know that it took me the first 15 minutes of this call to realize that I need to be more purposeful about my factions. But maybe there'll be some resources in the future that will help me with that. But
there just might be.
One thing that I wanted to loop back round to from earlier on is I think Josh, you mentioned about how you wanted to take a step away from like factions basically being a synonym for like the bad guys, or all factions being bad guys, and that is super tricky. At least I find, because that's easy, right? They're the bad guys. That's easy. Right. That's, yes, it's always useful to have blanket bad guys at some point. They serve a purpose, but when you want to build these very enriched three-dimensional worlds, you need to build in those layers of nuance, which is where I certainly find it tricky to not make NPCs, very straight all the time and very extreme, I guess is the word, or good or bad. It's because they're easy to do here. And when I'm in the hot seat after 3 hours, sometimes I want something easy to do.
The classic example from the Wheel of Time, right, is I'm trying to remember the name of them, but the ones that dress in all white that are basically chasing the magic users.
The White Cloaks.
The White Cloaks, yeah, exactly. Very creative name that I couldn't come up with on the top of my tongue. But like that's like the stereotypical like I need a bad guy faction.
I started reading those books when I was in like my freshman year of high school, and they didn't finish before the author died. Sorry, continue.
Anyway, so go. Carry on, Daniel. Sorry.
No. That's I see. So I see what you're saying. Like there is a time and a place for those. These are the bad guys. This is what they're doing.
Yeah.
They're like a force of nature almost at that point. It's
the White Cloaks. To be clear, they aren't specifically bad guys. They're moralists. They're kind of moralists, but not at the same time. And they'll do a lot of bad things in pursuit of the light. But they serve the light just in the most extreme fashion possible, which is also a fun thing to do with factions. You can make them kinda good. You can call them Star-Lord factions, a bit of both.
I think the Gold Cloaks are a great example of, again, they have this organization. You had your core characters, at least, and I'm speaking specifically of what we saw on television because I have not read the books. I am not as up to speed. So,
are you still on White Cloaks? Because you said Gold Cloaks, which takes me to the Kingsguard and Game of Thrones.
I apologize. I'm speaking about the White Cloaks.
Okay, just want to make sure you weren't jumping factions.
No. I'm still on the White Cloaks. But again, you saw the fear on the eyes of the characters who should have known them in their backgrounds. Very well done. Like, I knew instantly just from the way the actors portrayed the characters, this is a concern.
Oh, yes.
Auditorially, there was music that led to we should be concerned. Those characters who were not in the know were looking at the characters who were in the know, and you could see that, okay, what are we doing here? And you got that. Don't say anything. I don't even remember if the words were said, but it's don't say anything. We got to get out of this, and we got to get out of here quickly. Like, that was very clear and well done. Mm-hmm. But then when it came down to showing how militant and how dangerous they could be, they focused on one character. And I don't remember that character's name, but it was clear. In almost the same way you had and I can't remember his last name. I believe his first name is Daniel, but you had that one bad guy that was chasing Captain Mal and Firefly. You had that one guy who represented the entity that the player characters are against, or the hero characters were
specifically
against.
From Serenity, the movie that capped Firefly.
Yeah.
Is when that character appeared, the agent.
Yeah, the agent. And you got to see the facets of him. You got to see kind of elements of where he might be right, but elements of where he was clearly wrong. You got to see his...
And he knew it too, though. He's like, I'm not good enough for the society I'm trying to help create because of the things I have to do.
Yeah,
he was a great bad guy.
Yeah, he was exceptionally well played. You see that in elements of Namor in Wakanda Forever. There's no doubt in the way that was portrayed that Namor was a good guy. He knew he wasn't doing good things, but he knew what he was doing was necessary for for his goals and for the goals of his people. And playing that in a game, as long as you've covered those bases in your session zero, and that's what everybody's on board for, absolutely powerful magic and stories that nobody's forgetting. I just think that the way to kind of look at that is I look at factions can fall into really three categories: enemies, benefactors, and other things. And within those, they break down in different ways. There's different ways to display them. But I think we're talking about, for benefactors, they can be quest givers. They can be tools for aiding the players. It's who they go to. It's the guy who runs the magic shop in Vox Machina. While it's one individual, you could have a faction like that, where basically there's a shop in every place. They've got a card where they've made friends with them at lower tiers. So now wherever they go in the world, as they branch out from their region, they can seek help from this group. There's different ways to do that, and they're all viable and good. You just kind of have to think about that.
When I think about benefactor factions, I think about the show The Nevers, which is a show that tragically lived not long enough. But with Prudence and Amalia True, like what they're trying to do with finding all these people that have these special abilities and giving them a place to be and a place to live away from society, where they will be judged and where they will be hunted down for the most part, right? Like that, I think of what they're trying to do in the faction that they're building in that sort of benefactory way.
I gotta say, I'm gonna go off on a tangent just for a second. For those only listening to the show and not watching the video, Lewanika he's prepared a notepad and pen and paper for the episode, which is the first time in the history of the show that a guest has shown me their prepreration on the camera. So I'm just so happy right now.
Well, sometimes he needs kudos, and while we're kudoing him, I have a kudo to give him too. Because a little while ago, you were talking about Benito and how great he was for the way that he plays things and world builds and carries characters on into next generations. And you do that all the time, which is great because Benito is a fantastic DM. Benito, when you listen to this, no shade is cast towards you whatsoever in these statements. You're fantastic. But Lewanika often serves himself a little bit lower than he should, because my friend, you've been doing that same stuff since before you met Benito. The games that you and Marty ran populated the world that I played in later with you. My characters, like Anric Hammerfist, continued on and became the center of a religious community in your world before that. So don't sell yourself short, my friend. You are fantastic. Your style evolved with your mind and a lot of the rest of us. And Benito may have been an influence, but you were already a great DM.
I like to think of those were the kinds of things I wanted to do because I am a fan of media, whether it be reading books, Tolkien at the time. Dragonlance was fresh at the time that Marty and I were DMing and playing. Initially, Marty and I played solo. Like Marty would DM for me, I would DM for him, and we built that world that way. And then it was later on where we connected with others and built a group and we started playing. I moved to Maine to go to college. I built a group that played in that world while Marty was running Glen and several others in that group down south. It was my first foray into two DMs co-running campaign world. And it had its challenges. We weren't great at it, but we learned and we evolved. So I think the ideas were there. What I got was refinement through every stage of my tabletop role-playing history.
Yes,
you know,
we all did.
Where I started was refined by some of Benito's early work. Then when I got into LARP, going to games that Josh ran, going to games that were run by Adam Scaramella, and playing in Haven, and just being a part of some of the factions that Adam ran, I learned a lot. Heaven help me if I leave out my dear friend Jamie and how she ran the Guru group part of Darkness Down East, the LARP that Josh and Sheldon, another friend of our show, ran. I would be absolutely remiss. Everything I know about playing Guru, I learned really from Jamie and Chris at the time, both dear friends. I'm still in contact with them, communicate with them regularly. I learned there, and I have brought all of those elements from all these desperate games into what I do. Even me building character sheets for businesses. I actually got that from Palladium. That's something Palladium did in Ninjas and Super Spies when we used to play that game. They said if you're Ninjas and Super Spies, you're working against an organization. So they had a template for building an organization. That's shorthand for faction, because many of the things were about the people that operated. Palladium being what it is very mechanical. So a lot of it was how much money do you have to spend on a project. A lot of it was what kind of vehicles do you have? What kind of weapons do you have? What kind of training do people have? What kind of equipment do people have? But there were also what kind of direction are you going in? Some of that was left to narrative. You write it in, but they gave this nice template. Versions of that I have ported into other games and built character sheets for that. It is not dissimilar to what Star Trek does with its ships. The ship is a character. and it has a mission profile. Your ship in a D20 system like Star Trek Modiphius or Star Trek Adventures RPG is a faction. If you think about the Enterprise crew interacting with another crew, again, I'm going to go back to DS9, my favorite Star Trek show. When the Vulcan Starfleet ship showed up, what did they do? They played a baseball game because they were two different factions that had a rivalry. That's amazing. And we can do that in our games, literally and figuratively. I have ideas for the Star Trek actual play along those lines. But
that's a great episode, actually.
It's actually one of my favorites. Not the least of which the team was the Niners, and I love the San Francisco 49ers.
Of course.
There's that. But again, like when we talk about factions, there are so many different ways to slice that apple, and all of them are viable. All of them are good. Like any soup, you don't want all of them in one soup, but you can pick and choose which ones you need for your group. And if you use techniques like the collaborative role building, if you use processes like doing a session 0, your players will let you know what they're in for. And then you can decide the types of factions that make sense for the overall game you were looking at or wanted to create, the specific players at your table and what they want. And then as a game master, just pay attention as you're playing. They evolve. Their characters change the circumstances. Maybe they decide they want to know more about the monk order that they left at the top of the mountain. Now you've got a great quest arc. Or we're going to go back to that mountain. What's happened to that mountain in the interim? Was there another faction that the player character didn't necessarily mention early on? But you could talk to them. If they were going to have a rival, what would they look like? And then you can build that yourself using whatever format you want. And now there's a conflict for them to go back to, so he can get back involved with his people. And then the questions of, why did you leave? How do you feel about your leaving? How do they feel about your leaving? Makes sense. Literature is bereft with examples of, but you left us at our hour of need and now you're back and you want help. That is one of the greatest, most tropey things that happens in all of fiction. But it works almost every time. And even if the rest of it's bad, that works well because we all relate to it. We all relate to, I went back to high school. I got to my high school graduation. I went and finally got connected with my old Boy Scout troop. I was back in my old neighborhood one time too many. And there's the friend that I no longer hang out with. We're still friends-ish, but is there a resentment because I got out and he didn't? Those are the kinds of things that really can come out and play. And because people connect with that on an internal and visceral real world level, that really adds vibrant color to what you see at the table.
Absolutely. I don't know if Glenn, you had something you wanted to.
I did. The downside being that it's very difficult to play off of the things that Lewanika says because he never stops. And it was about a soup comment, which was like 10 minutes ago, so it won't make any sense anymore.
Go for it.
I'll cut in the soup comment here, and then so for the listeners, it's just like that, you know.
When we talk about factions, there are so many different ways to slice that apple, and all of them are viable. All of them are good. Like any soup, you don't want all of them in one soup, but you can pick and choose which ones you need for your group.
Well, I like that you brought up the soup and the ingredients thing because it was a way for me to segue to the fact that you can have factions within factions too. They don't have to stay static in that notion either. So you could have tomato bisque sitting beside lobster bisque, and they're very similar except for a few of the ingredients in them. And those could be two different factions. But you get to a stew and it's got all of those ingredients. Some of them are going to have different opinions too. And the example I'm going to bring goes back into TV shows again, because, you know, that's where we draw a lot of inspiration, and those stories help inspire, thoughts during the middle of podcasts while we're chatting too. So going back to Shadow and Bone, the nation of Ravka has the Grisha and the non-Grisha citizens, right? So that's already two factions. Then when you go into their military, they've got First Army, Second Army, where that continues. But inside Second Army, inside the Grisha themselves, you have all of the different types of Grisha. They're all their own factions with their own styles and agendas between the Heartrenders and the Durists and the Tailors, just based on their powers, their power structures, and how they can help society. They almost have their own ranking for usefulness to the Darkling in there, for each faction. And having all of those separate pieces combined with the costuming and the way that the show, a lot of it was already set up in the book, but the show really, really brought the world to life with the costuming and the way that they really developed each of the sects and the keftas that they wear. But each of those individual orders within the Grisha help bring it to life and help make it more than it is. It helped make it more than just an army of magic users. And it's all about how macro versus micro you want to go. If you start out really macro, you're looking at the nation level. Even within a government, there's going to be different factions. So don't forget that when you're working on your worlds. You're going to have different political parties. Each of those is going to be a faction. And each section or faction of your world is going to have further divides in it. Your military is going to have multiple factions in it because there's going to be more than likely multiple branches. All you need is an army and a navy. Now you got two factions. That's all it takes.
Yeah.
So it really is a broad topic, and it branches down and drills down the further you go, deeper and deeper into your society, all the way down to you can have different factions in a neighborhood if you really want to.
Yeah. The only other thing that I will say on and I think Lewanika, you cracked open this topic in a huge way. You'd also mentioned the concept of rival factions, right? And just to go ahead and bring like a source that folks can use, like, yes, watch all of Shadow and Bone, watch all of every show that Star Trek ever did, watch Firefly, watch all these things. Or, and one book that I can recommend is the way that rivals were handled in the Call of the Netherdeep book that Wizards put out last year.
Yes.
Good call. Very true.
The whole plot is that your party's trying to do a thing, and there is a rival party that is trying to do the thing too. And so the entire plot kind of circles not only around the thing that you're trying to do, but also how do you interact with this rival faction, like this group of rivals? Do you try to befriend them? Do they try to befriend you? Do you work together in any way, or are they always against you? It really kind of plays into that progression to go ahead and so if you're looking for like a concrete way to bring a small faction, and specifically to go ahead and pit a group of rivals against you, that's a fantastic template.
Yeah, I think, and I would say that it's important to always keep in mind: start small, show don't tell, and build. If you take the general, and I'm going to go to 5e. If you take the general tier structure, which actually goes beyond 5e, in any game that has a leveling system, this is probably fairly accurate, though the specific number may not be at 5th level, at 10th level, or what have you.
Of course.
But generally, there's tiers of play. When you start in your tier 1, you're talking local. In a city game, it's your neighborhood or even your block. In a nationwide game, it might be your town. But you start local. When you're in that level, your factions should really be more about that. You can mention larger factions. You can mention the Lord may be beholden to X, or his son joined group Y or Z. But at your local level, you don't want to bring in those things because it's overwielding. It's unmatched to what the player's experience should be at that level. So be focused on what they're handling. Once they've moved into that next tier, open that up. Let them handle more threats. Let them get away from necessarily Monster of the Week and let them handle more smaller arcs that involve improving, defeating, or joining a given faction and having more of that regional focus. Again, in the city game, you might be talking a borough of the city if it's a large enough city, or if you're in a nation game, it might be the entire county. And I'm going to use the English version of county. We here would call them states or what have you, but your county might be the region you're talking about. And then when you get into the next level, now we're talking nationwide. But as you go, your piece of a faction may have always been a part of the larger faction, which is a part of the larger faction. So you're growing your power within your organization. you can do great things, even though it's not built into the 5e game. I strongly recommend letting your characters get sidekicks who run followers. Borrow from 3.5. Just use the follower mechanics as though you had the feat. You don't have to give them a feat. I would recommend doing so, but run it as though they had the dang feat.
Yeah. I mean,
and
it's
let
what
them
made the
be in
leadership
charge of
feat
people.
so powerful. It's what made it so powerful, is that leadership came with up to 20 in your retinue. I mean, cannon fodder for the most part, right? Like, you could use them for whatever you wanted.
Yeah. Everybody needs some red shirts.
Yeah. You know, but you could literally build these things, put in these mechanics, whether you do it very directly, like I'm going to create a feat for this, or you're just going to say, I'm going to use this mechanic and roll it. That's kind of what I did when I described what I did earlier, is like, I'm basically using the same mechanisms for the leadership feat, and I'm just rolling it all out. But that's what I was doing. It was like, if you're at 20th level and you have this level of power and this level of influence, people will follow you. There's a reason, rightly or wrongly, a popular athlete in high school has people that still remember him and talk to him and talk about him to this day. There's a reason for that.
Followed them around the halls in giant circles and groups.
Yeah, you know. Now, we would want them to be better people. That's what we're hoping our players will be, but that's not always the case, right? So, but I think that that's the way you do it. You build into the factions as you go, and you give them the factions that they have the ability to influence, interact with, appropriate to their level.
That lifting back the fog when you hit that tier thing is such a powerful piece of narrative. Like, having the players have been fighting against some group of individuals, some force, and then they finally finish that arc, that chapter, and then the rest of the fog of war reveals the rest of the map, the rest of the nation, and it's like, oh, that was just one sect of this whole other big thing. Is such a powerful, like, oh, okay, that was just the training wheels. Right now we're here. What have we done? Have we just pissed off like an actual big thing? It's such a powerful narrative beat there. And I wanted to jump off the back of what you were just saying there, and I think you mentioned it before about how you did a lot of learning, Lewanika. I think we all have. You get better as you GM and play more. And I think it's very, very, very fair to say, when there are newer GMs or when you are just cutting your teeth at it, it absolutely start with those more two-dimensional factions. Like, have the bad guys be the bad guys. Absolutely wet the whistle on that. But then you can pepper in just one person who's ostensibly of that faction, but it's actually like, I'm having second thoughts because beheading all these innocent people seems wrong to me. And then you've already set the seed then to be like, well, there are dissenters within that faction, and maybe we can build on that. And then, just like how Lewanika, you were saying, you can build it up through the tiers. You can start with something like that and then just spin it out from there.
Think about how in Game of Thrones, when Joffrey was king, the more things he did that were extreme and brutal and uncalled for, the more people in his retinue and the closer the people who were closer to him started to think, maybe Joffrey's not who we want on the throne. How do we fix this? We have now got ourselves into some shit. How do we get ourselves out?
He seemed a perfect candidate. I was horribly upset when they killed him.
I was horribly upset they took that long.
You're right, exactly.
Like, he needed to go. No shade towards the actor. The actor's brilliant. I thought he did a great job.
Never gonna be able to work again, but that's
I also think about newer GMs, and as they do this, and you're right, building in that either a lieutenant or that new guy who's like, man, I'm just not down for this. This is not what I signed on for. Makes sense. DS9 had Damar working with, standing alongside Gul Dukat for a long time. And if you do a rewatch of those episodes, you'll see a lot of that actor's side glances and looks like, this is what we're doing now. And he may have gone on for it in the earlier seasons. But as you got towards the end, I'm breaking away from Gul Dukat. I'm breaking away from the Dominion. I'm forming a resistance on Cardassia Prime, was not a stretch. It surprised no one because of that little bit of work that was done in the quote unquote earlier tiers of play, where it was a glance, it was a comment like, can't we do this instead? No, we're going to do this. Okay. That's the kind of thing that really works in a game. And again, it's a show don't tell. If you get to those climactic moments in your fourth tier play, if you've got a group that's blessed enough and worked hard enough, because it's hard work to get to a fourth tier of play for everyone involved. If you're blessed enough to get to that point and there's something that a faction does that's a surprise, you've missed some opportunities along the way. Don't be scared of it. Do what you got to do to make your story go. But again, if we're being purposeful, now we kind of can talk about and we can learn. And our goal at Tabletop Journeys is to help provide those tools and those techniques to get you there so that you are a little bit more purposeful in the early echelons of this process. So that that new DM who's starting with a tier 1, they're building characters at level 2 before anybody even gets their subclasses, or right at level 3 when they are starting with their subclasses. We're going to give them, we want to be able to talk in ways that give them techniques that they can use right then and there, so that as that group grows and they have that engagement all along, which will help make that hard work easier, and they get to those climactic moments, it's going to really pay off for them.
Mm-hmm. We were talking about helping people who are starting out and saying, when you are starting out, work with the 2-dimensional, work with factions that already exist.
Mm.
When you're first trying to learn how to do this, especially when you're looking at something really abstract, like, okay, create a faction, go. Well, what goes in a faction? It's hard to just come up with everything on your own off the get. So look at the resources that are out there. The Harpers come up a number of times in Forgotten Realms. There's a bunch of different things you can go through. One of the things I would recommend is actually the Adventures League Guide to the Factions of Faerun document. It's not terribly long, but it takes the factions of Faerun and breaks them down individually into their ranks and what can happen in the different ranks, toolkits you can learn from them, goals of the faction, and it gives you a template. I'm not saying use the Harpers in your world. I'm saying find something to use as a template to help you think of the things and create them as you go, so you don't forget to come up with a name for each rank or specific goals or any of the little pieces that you need to help it come to life. Borrow from another source and make it your own is a really good way to get started, and then you kind of build from there.
If you're building a Thieves Guild in a city campaign, and I keep going back to this because I think city campaigns are really a fertile ground for faction work, you can use any well-done mob movie as a template.
True story. You got to create your own template from the mob, but
I mean, the Godfather, Casino, Goodfellas. If you're talking about somebody who's infiltrating a faction, Donnie Brasco, immeasurable and innumerable movies and shows that go into
Johnny Dangerously.
If you're on the more comedic slapstick side, my mother interrupted my conversation once, just once,
just once.
And I say that with great reverence to Joe Piscopo, who I still follow on social media because he is amazing. Saw him in concert once. He is brilliant. If you get a chance to see Joe Piscopo,
Daniel, tell me that Johnny Dangerously is a movie that is known in the UK.
It might well be. I have to say I was drawing a blank. Hands up.
Of all the things we have sent back across the pond, if we missed on that, we in America have failed the entire UK.
It's an old Michael Keaton movie that's hysterically funny, but also super lame because it's that kind of funny. So if you do decide to look it up, be prepared.
Yeah.
Oh, no, they're my favorite kind of film.
It is cheesy as all get out.
Mid-80s Michael Keaton. Yeah.
Oh, I mean, you even had an old U.S. comic, Father Guido Sarducci, in that as they were going to a Capitol. They were actually taking somebody to the chair, and he was doing a bit as they're walking down, and he's like, "Alpha cum laude, magnum cum laude. The radio is too loudy." It was absolute hysterics. I love that movie. And Joe Piscopo.
I'm sure it's got a number of topics that would qualify as cringeworthy today, but we didn't think of it that way yet in the 80s.
Yeah. But brilliant fun.
One final thing to round out the episode then. I wanted to talk about it briefly earlier on, but we'll try and do a fast-paced one from each of you. Around when you're a player, and you either get given a faction from the setting or the GM, or you work together with one to build them, or you come up with one, yourself. You've heard of the Harpers, you read a book once or saw the film recently and said, I want to do what that person did in the film.
Which I enjoyed. I don't know about anybody else, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say I thought it was a good movie.
We enjoyed it very much so. Everyone that saw it here, even my girlfriend who has played D&D like 2 times in her life, enjoyed it. So say that's you either have a player or have been those players in the past. How do you deal with operating within those parameters, those frameworks, those like Harpers? They don't have any pay; they just do it because it's the good thing to do.
Sure.
When it comes to role playing, when it comes to being at a table and it being an inherently agency giving, the words escape me, but you want to have control, you want to define your own story, and suddenly you've kind of put constraints on yourself in a way. I know, like mother is a necessity. Nope. Yeah. What's the phrase?
Mother's the necessity of invention.
Invention. Yes. Yeah. So like having those constraints can obviously enable and kind of build to unique things, but obviously maybe there's more there to it than maybe newer players have appreciated.
So I like the way you laid that out because it feeds really, really nicely into my answer. I think the one thing as a player, if you are a member of a faction, the one thing you have to be aware of is the line that exists between the way your character would act in a given situation and the social contract that you are operating within as a player.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to be the player that always kind of relies on, well, I'm moving against the party. I'm a member of the Thieves Guild, so I'm stealing everybody's loot when they're sleeping because that's what my character would do, right? So remember the social contract, right? You may try to steal everybody's loot except for the player characters, the people that you are traveling with, because all that's going to do is it's going to breed conflict. It's going to breed player-on-player conflict, which, unless that's the nature of the game that you're playing, is not always a welcome development.
I don't think player-on-player conflict is probably ever character-on-character conflict. Absolutely.
Okay,
that's the juiciest, meatiest moment.
Right. If somebody goes across the table at somebody else.
Yeah, that's like, but that you're absolutely right. Like it bleeds the line there. If another player character is always stealing my stuff, Danilo is going to get annoyed.
Right. Exactly.
And I think rightly so.
Right. Yeah. And your character may just kill him. Yeah.
Yeah.
The way I try to phrase that to players when we're establishing the social contract in our session 0 is, you're designing a character that you want to play and that you're going to have fun with. But it's not just about, once you've created them, always doing exactly what the character would do. You have a responsibility not to say, but my character would do this, but instead to come up with a reason why they would continue working with the party, even in the face of a conflict, because otherwise no one's going to have any fun.
Mm-hmm.
If you steal the party stuff and right away in the middle of the night, because that's what your character would do, you're going to find the next time there's a gaming session, you're sitting home alone on your couch all by yourself and sad because you have no friends.
Right.
And the Cookie Monster has no cookies.
Right.
Yes.
I would follow that by saying my personal take on how I handle that as a player has a lot to do with what goes on in the session 0. So even if I'm playing in a game where there is no session 0, as a player, I kind of find a way to do that with my GM. Even if it's after that first game session, if it's an ongoing game, I will find a way to sequester myself and the GM or storyteller to have some of those session 0 conversations. So I have a better idea of kind of what I'm going to do. And I will pay very much attention in that first session where there's no session 0 to how the other players are playing, because characters have options. They can choose to do different things. Players decide which of those options the characters take.
Mm-hmm.
Like Josh mentioned, don't steal stuff because it's what my character would do. Like Glenn said, you have a social contract. You got to look at where you might be able to go with that. My thought is the character has options all across that spectrum. You as a player, figure out which option matches your table the best, and then your job becomes finding the in-game motivation for the character to do that. So now you have explained the action that works best for the table with this other in-game information. That's how I kind of approach that. If a storyteller holds a session 0, most of that work can be done in that. Mm-hmm. And the instruction of build a character that works with the party, if you're building your characters there or you're adjusting your characters in that session before gameplay truly starts, that's great. I also think of a couple things personally in regards to factions. Is the faction my job? Or is it my family? Or is it my found family? The answers to those three questions can greatly inform how I interact with that faction as a player character. Following that, is the party my job? Are they my friends? Are they my found family? My newfound family in some cases. And then how I interact with them. And in many games where the characters may not know each other well until they get together, the answer is they have to. It starts as a job. By tier 2, they're friends. By tier 3, they're found family. That's how I play it. That's how I've played my character in Streams of Spiro. It was job, friends, found family. And now that we're in tier 4 with those characters, they are my sole purpose. And there is no sacrifice for that party that my character will not engage in. That's my type of character development. I believe that's relatively consistent throughout most characters I play, because that's how I manage as a player the social contract. That's how the party gets stronger. And if you think about the arcs in most of the media we have, that's fairly similar to what we see in most media with groups of desperate peoples that get together and eventually work together. Certainly what happened and what was happening in Firefly, though they sped it up because Fox is terrible for genre shows, and we didn't get 5 or 6 seasons of Firefly as we should have. And it was definitely sped up by time we got Serenity, the movie. But that's exactly what they were doing throughout that. And there were episodes along the way, whether it was going to the planet where Jane was celebrated and the Ballad of Jane was sung.
The man they called Jane.
Yeah, those are the kind of moments where, like, oh, okay, so now these things make purpose. And just because I like Adam Baldwin as an actor, even his approach to the series Chuck and its 5 seasons, where he was in
great segue. I love Chuck.
Yeah, where he was at the beginning of that show versus the end, and how he interacted with Chuck and how he interacted with all the other characters, that altered throughout, and it was basically along those lines: job, friends, found family, my purpose. And I think that's a great way to deal with factions. And if you think about your character, the party becomes your faction in that process. So as the party becomes your faction, unless the whole party joins a faction together, you are literally taking your character out of that process of being in the external faction to this internal faction. So where you start with them really tells you how you become that with the others. So if you started with, these are my purpose, you have to walk down that list with one group as you're building up the list with the other. And so where you start and where you end is your character development. That's how I look at it.
Excellent. Well,
not very fast. I'm sorry.
That's why I chuckled when you said a fast round.
Yeah. Maybe I should go to the restroom now. It's like
I'm gonna.
I actually wrote
I only
the
have
word
so much
chuckle.
Power. Well, I think that pretty much brings us to the end, gentlemen, of our discussion today on factions. So, as is
I think we could probably keep talking about it for another hour.
So
it brings us into the show, of course. But.
Yeah, it sounds like you're going to be on our show. We're similar to Space. We're going to borrow the format for the tail end of this discussion at some point in the near future.
There are several things that I've thought of as well that have to get locked away somewhere. But as is tradition, is there anything that you guys would like to promote?
What? I mean, how kind of you to ask, Danilo, because there just happens to be. So as we said at the top of the show here, so we just finished up the final writing and final layout and everything of our 3rd book. And as Glenn alluded to at the beginning of the show here, the reason why factions has been on our mind and why we've been doing a lot of research kind of among the 3 of us in how factions are built and why factions are built and all that stuff is that this is the first time that we're going to be announcing our 4th book. So this fall coming to Kickstarter, and we don't have the date exactly nailed down yet, so you're just going to have to watch Tabletop Journeys to go ahead and get the exact date. But this fall, we're going to be kickstarting our 4th book, and it's going to be a book all about factions.
Awesome. And of course, the show itself.
Oh, I mean, of course.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. I mean, if you're interested in the Tabletop Journeys podcast, of course, you can check us out at www.ttrjourneys.com or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Well, let me fully fair. Either the other two, have you got any other things you would like to promote in addition to your found family TTJ?
Yeah. So I can honestly say that I am finding great love with Star Trek Adventures RPG. I highly recommend if it's a game you're remote, if anything we've said here tonight, or if you've heard it in passing, seen us on Twitter talking about it, definitely jump on. We're very early in the release schedule for this project. We have 3 episodes out, which are our Star Trek D20 Session 0. We're about to drop, or will at the time of this airing have just dropped, episode 1 or part of episode 1 for the actual adventure itself. Highly recommend watching that so you can kind of join in the fun and learn this great system, because even if Star Trek isn't your bag, sounds odd to me to say that out loud, but even if it were not your bag, there are some amazing things that we didn't even get to tonight, which is why you're going to have to be in our show, because I have notes about that as well. But it's going to be awesome where you can kind of get a real good view of the game and see some of the things that you want to take from the game and bring to your table, whatever system you're using. So a lot of fun, great stories. I love the stuff that Josh has been bringing to that. I'm glad it is both of us co-storytelling and co-writing this, because what I had, I think, was really good. What we now have with what Josh is doing is really freaking awesome good.
I'm looking forward to continuing this story. Yeah.
Nice. And to follow that up and finish the promotion for it, if that sounds like fun, if STA sounds like, and Star Trek Adventures, by the way, that's what STA is. Star Trek Adventures by Modiphius sounds like fun, and this game, this massive crew game that we're talking about sounds like your cup of tea. It is a Patreon only game, so you can go to our Patreon at www.patreon.com/ttjourneys and sign up there. Then contact us and let us know you want into the game. There's a few things to go over and talk to you about to make sure you're prepared to go on the air, but then we'll help you build a character and put you in, and then you just got to respond to the next poll for dates.
And again, that's pay to be one of the cast. The Patreon will allow you to be one of the cast members and go, but it is freely out to viewers or listeners to the podcast, so that there's no paywall for anybody who just wants to listen and enjoy the adventure.
Oh, of course. Yep.
Such a well-oiled machine, gentlemen. You covered all the bases there.
2.5 years now, so it's
You'd hope so. Yeah.
We got Twitter too, but that's them.
yeah.
All the links will be in the episode description as usual, and I would encourage everybody to go check out the sister show of Thinking Critically, Tabletop Journeys. Otherwise, all that's left to say is, from the bottom of my heart, thank you ever so much for your time this morning, gentlemen.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
Lovely to talk to you again. Like, we have to do this more often.
Absolutely.
Always fun. We'll get a date so we can have some more discussion on factions here in the near future.
Yep, absolutely. And of course, not only will all the links in the episode descriptions, Tabletop Journeys is linked all over the website and the guests and on all the episodes. There will now be 3 of them, so should be very easy to find. So that's it. That brings us to the end, guys. It breaks my heart to say, but it's that time. There's no more. I can't do it anymore. The listeners, they need a break.
It's very difficult to say goodbye. So what we'll say is, we'll see you all later.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm going to end it there. Done. I don't want to steal anyone's thunder.
Don't mess with the profession, right?
Now it's time for the Patreon shout-outs. Huge thank you to all my patrons, starting with Josh, Lewanika, and Glen, the 3 fabulous hosts of Tabletop Journeys who've been on the show several times before and who I'll always invite back. So go check out Tabletop Journeys at ttjourneys.com or at ttjourneys on Twitter. We also have Joe from the Fourth Leg podcast all about giving DMs another leg to stand on. Again, previous guests of the show, and I'd thoroughly encourage you to go and check out their great content. So you can find them at The Fourth Leg on Twitter. was have a good friend of the show, Optional Rule. You can go and find him out on optionalrule.com or at Optional Rule, full of very insightful and educated comments and thoughts and threads on the really nitty-gritty of D&D. We have, what a guy, Matthew Perkins, who is just out there in the world trying to make you laugh. So go and check him out at matthewperkins.net or at Hey It's Matty P, Mattyp, and good friend of the show and one of my table mates, Matthew Street. Go and check out his partner's hustle at virtualtimehustle.com or at mpstreet88 on Twitter.